I'd like to give a warm welcome to Riley and thank him for coming to Black Hat.
Okay, here we go. Hello, Black Hat Seattle. The overview of this talk is going to cover it's a very high level of worm technologies, virus technologies of the last 20 years. The security industry really hasn't had a chance to go in depth and study these. There's a lot of time that's required. So I want to provide everyone a general overview of things they're struggling with, security technologies, and how these threats are blending together, or exploits. You see, a lot of you guys deal with security systems to stop exploits. Worms are fairly new to us. We're now just learning about where these technologies are coming from. There's a friend of mine, Peter Zor, over at Symantec, calls them blended threats. Where you have an exploit, and you have like a virus, you blend them, and you have a worm. So I'm going to cover general worm design at a high level, to kind of give you guys some insight, and overall provide the security industry with some information about these, so we can begin to tackle them and understand them. Here we go. Traditional payloads used by worms and exploits are written in assembly language and are compiled with a machine code counterpart. Let's go over something very quickly. An exploit is more or less, think of it like this: you have a security hole and you have a payload. A virus is a payload. There's no security hole involved. A worm is a payload, an exploit linked to a security hole, and also propagation. You can kind of classify them in your mind like that. When it goes back to the blended threat thing, where you have a virus and you combine the security hole. It becomes blended threat. Exploit payloads contain a series of automated tasks that aid an attacker in gaining a more comfortable level of control over its target. This like a port binding shell, exploited payload, or a connect back. They want a higher level of comfortability. They don't feel comfortable directly running all their code like an automated attack. If attackers take all their code and put it in a payload, then they lose the risk of triggering security systems. But they feel more comfortable by having that shell, or having that back orifice connection. Something that allows them and makes them feel more comfortable. Worm payloads are similar to exploit payloads, but their nature is more automated. They also contain a series of tasks to aid in propagation. Code Red, Sapphire. This is more or less the algorithm, the pseudo-random like IP generation. This is the part of the payload that creates a list of IP addresses or targets and propagates itself. That's the main difference between an exploit and a worm. The first public appearance of advanced payloads occurred during the 1980s due to advancements in computer virus trends. With each new virus payload came an antivirus solution. Technical feats that were accomplished during this time are amazing. You have a very typical antivirus security scene. If they work, they call it EPI, entry point identification. You have what's like a PE or an executable on disk. When that's loaded in memory through the loading process. Maybe you guys are familiar with loading, maybe not, but you have linking and loading. Linking is when you compile a program, you build its parts together. You link in imports, exports, you set it up for loading. Loading is taking the file off of disk, mapping it into memory, and beginning execution at an entry point. This is where the code is, the main like startup routine. Antivirus products will make sure that entry point actually maps into the program. If it doesn't, the trigger is a virus. That would entail the virus somewhere is in memory and the entry point is pointing outside the file. Virus writers beat this by going to the entry point of the code and modifying it to redirect outside. So the entry point still points inside the image, but it'll redirect outside. Antivirus companies came back and said, okay, we can catch calls and jumps, these various instructions, it'll redirect. The next step they took was, in a very undetectable manner, hooking APIs, maybe hooking exit process. So when the program leaves, the payload's executed. Obviously, this becomes very difficult to detect. You can runtime modify the code, insert your virus, you can use an API hook. This is one typical problem they're running into. Entry point obfuscation is a technique for the virus writers to get around this scheme. Going back, as time passed, many virus writers created technologies that made antivirus detection extremely difficult, EPO. As their technologies advanced, they transcended the exploitation of various remote security holes, and the ultimate blended threat was introduced. As in 1988, on November 2nd, Robert Morris Jr. released an experimental worm from Cornell University. You guys are familiar with this, obviously, the Morris worm. According to him, it was just a test. He was just learning about how worms work, and it ran rampant, causing some $50,000 in damage in a very small amount of time. A decade later, we saw Code Red. Ryan Permo, one of the researchers I work with, was the key guy reversing Code Red. And going through until this day, we still see new things in Code Red that we didn't see before. Techniques that we didn't catch. There's one thing Code Red does that no one ever talked about. It uses exception handling, a series of nested exception handlers to catch faults. And depending on where these faults occur, the worm will take different actions. You can't see that unless you see these faults generated, which you'll see it going around different parts of the payload. Never saw it before. There's a whole series of things, and these larger worms. Some are not public, some we've looked at that have these extremely complex schemes that you don't see, but that may totally affect the way the worm's going to work. So we have to learn about them, obviously. Code Red caused over $2 billion in damage in the short period that it was around. It's still around now. You guys, if you have firewalls at home, you still see connections. It's still moving. It'll probably be around longer than I will. That's the weird thing about a worm is that if people keep reinstalling these default systems, it's going to reinfect them. It'll keep running. I mean, theoretically, in 10, 20 years, we may have 15, 20 worms rolling around still, taking up bandwidth, just because of that simple principle. People will keep reinstalling these systems because it's their preferred OS. Most people don't care about installing service packs still. The internet now estimated over 170 million hosts, with a $2.5 trillion economy has become part of everyday livelihood. We rely on it for communication, business, and even personal enjoyment. The Sapphire worm, recently released, has once again reminded us how volatile and fragile our internet has become. Payload Anatomy and Future Mutations will bring the general overview of technologies used to construct and deliver a new generation of payloads, things we may see in the next 5-10 years. The research review during this presentation is intended to assist the security community with predicting the future of payload technologies. I don't want to make this a design guide at all. That's why I gave a very high-level overview. I don't want to get up here and tell anybody how to write a worm. This is more or less for you guys when you see them, you know what the parts are. Someone can tell you, okay, it has this kind of loading scheme. You'll know that. You'll be able to make quick decisions on how to prevent further exploitation. Quick fixes. A lot of you guys maybe work for companies as CSOs, ISOs, and you need to quickly make a decision, quickly stop this thing. So I'm going to do a very high-level overview. Some parts I'll go a little bit low level, it's fine, but. The presentation, placement. We talk about the placement of the payload, where in the actual exploitation you can place it to get around various restrictions. Stealth, navigating around virtually every security system available currently. Reliability, hardening your payload. So if your address space is volatile, they'll still function and execute correctly. Also dynamic loading schemes, they're called RVA engines, locating APIs, a target application, and using those to your benefit. Optimization. This is the last and final stage. Someone writes a payload. Sometimes this process may take days or weeks. When the guy is done with this payload, he has everything he wants in there, whether it's a worm or an exploit. He'll go through byte by byte, operation by operation, and optimize it to be as small and as fast as possible before he finishes. Either he will release it, obviously, as we've seen, keep it to himself, or share the exploit with his friends. It's like an art form to them. It's a challenge. It's almost like a sense of narcissism you see in some of them, where they spend so much time on these, they don't want to release them if there's one flaw or one problem. It's got to be perfect. So that section's optimization. And then some example payloads that we developed internally to show future payload technologies and the possibilities. Of course, demonstration. Placement. During the initial communication between an attacker and his target, you place your payload during the exploit. You place it somewhere in that communication. For example, like IIS holes, like the dot printer overflow. It was an overflow in the host header. So many people place their payload there. Typical exploits will involve placing a payload in the buffer or data area that the override happens. We'll call that the exploit buffer. Typical ones place it there. You hear about people writing various decoders to get around filtering restrictions, ASCII shellcode, or Unicode decoders, various decoders to get around these schemes. But you can simply place your payload somewhere else. Code Red did this. Code Red places its payload in a data section. It's logical. You pick a protocol, or say the protocol you're writing a payload for. You find some component in that protocol that's dynamic in size, dynamic in nature. The application will have to support every possible data type, and it's dynamic in size. Perfect place to put a payload. And for example, file uploads. Binary data, you know that you can put data there. The trick is getting to that once you're exploiting the system. Talk about that later. And control structures. Windows heap overflows are considered very unreliable. You can increase the reliability and reliably exploit any heap-based overflow by activating control structures. What I mean by a control structure is, like, for example, say IS, or some other web server, some software product has various features in the protocol. Maybe it's encryption, compression, other features. By utilizing those, you may activate other portions of heap memory that are not normally used during your initial exploit. We released an advisory on an ASP, there's an integer overflow and chunk encoding. This is back about a year ago. Now, the initial integer overflow overwrote a structure in heap. Didn't cause any faults. But when we put the URL encode line and forced URL encoding, the structure that was there that was normally overwritten was activated, triggering faults. By using this methodology, you can activate structures throughout heap and increase the reliability of the exploit to 100%. Now we're going to go into stealth. Payloads may, actually exploits may contain support to bypass various security systems. Some use encryption. For example, you have a web server you're attacking. The web server supports SSL, an SSL connection. Very few IDS systems are configured to watch SSL traffic. If it has compression, it has compression. Utilize that. Just utilize the resources. Utilize what's in the target. If you put a payload inside a compressed stream, inside an encrypted stream, it's a gray area problem. I call it a gray area because it's something that no one's figured out a way to solve. An IDS can't perform these actions. It can't decompress every stream, or go and decrypt every stream. It's just too intensive. To do that, you just flood them with compressed encrypted data and it'll fall over. This is a gray area. Behavior analysis systems can't stop behavior that looks too normal. IDSs can't match patterns that look like normal traffic. It's false positives. It's a gray area. Utilize that. Encoding schemes. You have like UTF, Unicode encodings, base64. For example, like a HTTP protocol. You have your authorization : basic authorization. Put your payload inside the base64. That resource has using the authorization will decode it for you. Then you just find the virtual address space. Utilize the resources. Morphing engines. Morphing engines were developed throughout the late 80s and early 90s by virus writers to bypass simple signature matching systems in AB. We're seeing similar things in IDSs. There's an idea of Mutate written by K2 to create a polymorphic payload, meaning multiple forms, payload to differentiate. Polymorphic engines are fairly easy to identify. They have a general scheme. You take a payload, you encrypt it or modify it, and you place your decryption routine in front of it. And that routine will decrypt and execute it. AB systems developed simple heuristic analysis to find these small decryptors and decoders. There are only so many varying ways they can create them. ABs solve this problem. Now, yes, the Distiller will eventually migrate and do that themselves, probably in the next couple of years, include something along those lines. Metamorphism. Metamorphism is the new morphing technology. This is the polymorphism on crack. This is the new trick of virus writers. It's amazing. I'll give a lot of credit to virus writers. Some of the work they do is just simply amazing. It baffles me. It's the complexity. This guy, a metal driller from a group called 29A, wrote a metamorphic virus called Metaphor. It's 14,000 lines of assembly. 90% was a metamorphic engine. That's it. He calls it the accordion model. You take a payload, you create a pseudo-assembly, like a virus writer assembly. There's structures of operations, so you can have a payload that works on multiple architectures. Then he goes into a phase called shrinking, where he removes all previous modifications in that payload, kind of virginizing it back to its original state. And he does permutation. Takes the payload, he breaks it apart in pieces, reorganizes it, connects it with jumps, permutates it. Then he expands it, his expansion routine, where he modifies operations. Some of you are familiar with assembly, you can do various routines the same way, or in different ways rather. Like you have maybe a push 7 pop ECX to get 7 ECX. You can also do move ECX, comma 7. You're basically just getting a value there, showing there's multiple ways to do the same thing. That's how the expansion routine works. It goes through and modifies the payload, just changing instructions, changing mannerisms. He also has weight-based genetic algorithms in his morphing engine to increase the reliability of future generations. No one's really figured out a way to detect these kind of viruses yet. I talked to Peter Zor from Symantec, and they have some basic solutions. But engines that powerful, they don't know what to deal with because the entire payload will change. It's the same thing, but the entire thing will change, and it'll change different every time. We haven't seen these in worms. We haven't seen anything like this. We haven't seen even a polymorphic engine. But these guys are writing worms. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, check out 29a.box.sk. They wrote a worm, or one of them wrote a worm for a .printer. Never released it. We never saw it. No one compiled it and ran it. Someone could have. And it's a lot more powerful than code red. It's there in source. They've been writing these for the last 10 or 15 years. Not for the purpose of causing destruction. For them, it's just an art form, going back to that. It's a challenge. It's a way of conveying their abilities to their peers. Yeah. Is that better? Metamorphosis. Go on to reliability. Increasing the reliability of your payload, hardening, making it more reliable given a volatile virtual address space. We're going to cover dynamic loading and fault handling. Dynamic loading engines, nicknamed RVA engines, locate entry points inside an address space. So you want to create a process. You want to bind a shell to a port. You have to locate the entry point for a create process so you can execute that function. Dynamic loader engines locate these entry points. These are all the schemes, public and private, that people use. The first is the PEB. Every process, every thread has an information block. This is passed down from the OS2 days. It's referenced from a segment register in the CPU. So threads can quickly access information they need to get to exception handlers, to get to various other information inside the thread or inside the process. Each TIB per thread, each one also references the PEB. This is the process environment block. Environment variables can be located here, the base address of the image, various other things. By utilizing the PEB, you can locate necessary things to create an engine. Engine design is usually one of two things. It uses imports or exports. For example, I need info. IS will import from kernel 32, import functions, create process, load library, get proc address. So if you can locate those imports, you can get access to those entry points, and you can use these functions. Or you can go the export route. You can find a module in memory, kernel 32, and get the exports from that. The key thing in dynamic loaders is finding the base address of the module. You've got to find where that thing starts, where it loads, so you can begin to walk up and find the imports or find the exports. Most RVA engines that have been using exploits are based. I mean, there's a hard-coded base where they start from there and they hard-code it. The base changes, the exploit won't work. The newer ones in the last 6 months, some of them are baseless. They're using a PEB, or they use a thing, I call it address rolling. I don't really have a name for it. Well, all you have to do is find an address on the stack, in heap, PEB, somewhere else. You take this address and you roll back until you find the base. You can find the base by a signature in a PE. It's a little MZ header. You can tag it there. It's called address rolling. There's a case-by-case scheme there too, where, for example, we have an IS flaw and we want to find good kernel 32 base, and we're down somewhere in a call stack. Somewhere down our stack is an address for kernel 32. Always there. Take that, roll back, and you can write 20, 30 byte RVA engines. They're very reliable. Also, fingerprinting. This scheme is it's not as popular, but I guess it was designed to make really small RVA engines once again, where you can kind of fingerprint various things in your environment. Some people will fingerprint the import table. Some will actually fingerprint code. Maybe fingerprint some bytes and get proc address. Very fast. One example fingerprinting scheme is you start the base, you scan forward for kern. Like looking in like a kernel 32, you scan forward. When you find kern, take that address, subtract from the base, you have an RVA. Go back to the beginning, scan again to the end, and you'll find it inside the export header. Take that, check back 8 bytes. If it's -1 or 0, you know it's the exports. 10 byte RVA. Yeah. Relative virtual address. Every virtual address space, sometimes you'll rebase an image. You'll change the base location. And you need to be able to replicate the environment or fix the environment. They're called fix-ups, relocations. So you have these virtual addresses that allow you to kind of guesstimate where things are going to be replaced. Okay. Let's move on to the next section. Does anybody have any questions about RBA engines or dynamic loaders at all?
The important point here, it says that for those guys that are using hard-coded base addresses, which is very common, just reorganizing modules leads to racial virus.
Exactly, definitely. That scheme can still be bypassed, but for existing, I mean, if you want to keep code red from infecting, rebase, yeah, definitely. Rebasing is actually it's an interesting technology people are looking into as an added layer solution. It's not a full solution, but is adding a layer of security. It does add a layer of security. It stops automated exploits. It can be bypassed once again, but we're all about layers. Nothing's perfect. The more layers, the better. Fault handling. Sometimes during the exploit process, the environment may be corrupted. We researched vulnerability in PNG image formats. There was an integer overflow. We couldn't control the size that it overwrote with. It just simply overwrote until it hit a boundary, a memory boundary. Triggered a fault. Now this boundary contained a lot of heap data structures. When various threads try to access that, they'd get violations. That has been corrupted. So a mediator solution is to use exception handlers in your payload. Replace the default filter with a small piece of code that suspends a thread or terminates it. Then every thread that faults will be suspended. And you can keep your environment under control until you're done. Also wrapping like RBA routines, dynamic loaders. Depending on the complexity, it may be prone to problems. By wrapping with exception handlers, you can catch these problems and continue. You can also write, using exception handlers, you can write various other kind of tricks, various other payloads. Like maybe you want to scan the entire virtual address space for something. By using exception handler, you can scan. When it hits a fault, increment the address. It's a very slow process, but you have that kind of scanning you can do that's used in some viruses. Any questions on fault handling at all? Okay. Optimization. This is the last and final phase of the payload. This is where all the tricks that the virus writers have come out, and this is really they truly show off their abilities. You have things like using smaller instructions, utilizing, like if you're going to move a value that's a word, move it to the lower word of a register, safe space, instead of the entire register. Various other tricks, just using instructions that are smaller overall, just knowing the system, knowing the hardware. Low cycle instructions. I think it's a PhD wrote a document describing all the cycles per instruction, like a Pentium 2 and Pentium 3. A lot of virus writers will go through their payloads, instruction by instruction, making it as fast as possible, using low cycle instructions. There's no real purpose for this. It's just an added touch. It's not going to evade any like race condition security system or anything. It's just for fun. Why you would spend 2 weeks pipelining and low cycling a payload, I don't understand, but gotta respect the guys for doing it, I guess. Pairing. You have 2 pipes in your CPU, pipe 0, pipe 1. If you use instructions that don't use the same registers and use them in a way you can have these instructions execute at the same time. I call it pairing or pipelining. One more way to make it faster. I mean, maybe there is a speed use. Maybe you exploit an IDS system, and you want to kill the IDS system before it sends out an alert. For example, like say you have like I won't use the name there. say it catches it. Say it catches a SIG in your payload. If you can disable the IDS before it sends out the alert, maybe a condition for speed there. I don't know. We haven't seen any of this in use, but it's possible. Using added chip features. The Intel chip has an FPU and MMX and various other video registers, mainly for multimedia. By utilizing these chips, you can sometimes speed up payloads, memory copy routines. Was it Michael Abrash, I think his name was? That's kind of the almighty god of code optimization to all the optimizers. He's written several books, great books on code optimization. This guy really knows his stuff. It's pretty cool. One of his tricks was using the FPU to copy memory because it was a little bit faster. You can also get your current EIP using the FPU. Actually, I'll show you guys that real quick. It's a little bit more efficient than a call ret. It works by you run an FPU instruction. I use fnop. It's like a regular Intel nop. Then you store your FPU environment. It has the last FPU instruction. Because I use a nop, that was my last instruction. I store it on a stack. Now that it's on the stack, we'll go check it out. There we go. Now it's an AX. We have our current EIP. Just another way to get EIP. Sometimes they're limited with payloads because of filtering. It's one scheme you can use instead of a call ret, or jump call rather. MMX registers. You have about 8 more registers you can use. During writing very complex payloads, you can utilize these to aid in just with the easiness of writing a payload. Maybe a lot of payloads will push and save values when they're going through complex routines. By utilizing these extra registers, you can store information there. And your payload's going to be a little bit more complex, and you can still focus on them and not lose your mind. The payloads. These are the payloads we developed internally to show the future of payload technologies. Fakeload and Rio. Fakeloading concept. When you load a file from disk, you take it, you map it into memory, you map each section, code, data, miscellaneous sections. You map them into memory. Then you process the imports, you create the IET, you put the entry points in these tables. Then you do relocations if you need to relocate, where you relocate all the data, hard-code addresses. There's a fix-up block for every 4K page. And you go and you update each one of these pages of its fix-ups. Fake loading works by taking a P file, a buffer. Instead of opening it from disk, we map it into the existing virtual address space of our process. So we can take, instead of spawning cmd.exe, I'll just map it inside another virtual address space. I don't create a process, I don't create a thread. CMD actually will do more than what's assumed. You want to use something with small level APIs because CMD.exe will do all sorts of crazy stuff while it's running, interact with NTBDM and a subsystem. But what if you write a payload just using TCP sock sends and receives? Already being used by the application. You don't create a process, you don't create a thread, and you're going to look, for the most part, like the application. If you can exploit a routine where that call is being used, stopping this kind of thing becomes a voracious problem. Some of the features in our fake loading engine. For our example, I'm going to create an SSL connection to this machine. I'm going to download the payload across the connection into this machine. I'm going to fake load the payload into the existing IS address space. I'm going to use an exception handler, so any faults are generated, I'll catch, and I'll exit silently. The payload will run, and when it's done, silently be removed. Without ever triggering a fault, or any notification, no process created, no thread created, no difference in the normal behavior. Fakeload payload design, for our example. First, our decoder. Our decoder is an ASCII decoder. It's approximately 60 bytes as a 4/3 ratio. If you have a payload 750 bytes, you can encode into ASCII, be about 1,000 bytes of the encoder. Purely ASCII data. Going back, I said it earlier, you can get around most of these restrictions, but sometimes you're unlimited, like HTTP, you have control new lines and nulls. It uses delimiters to segregate information. If you have any of these in your payload, it may cause problems during execution. So we have our ASCII decoder. The fault handling system I was talking about, when any thread faults out, it suspends it, and we wrap every routine of the fake loading routine with a handler. So if a fault's generated, I'll just back up earlier in the payload and attempt a couple of re-attempts of certain procedures. Dynamic loader. I also have to say too, the ASCII decoder and dynamic loader were written by one of our new researchers, Derek Soda, we got from Texas. He was really happy about having that, so put that in. The dynamic loader is, I think ours is the import-based one on this one. Actually, export loader. Uses a fingerprinting scheme we talked about earlier with the 3 scans. It's approximately 50 bytes, works on every version of Windows, locates entry points for get proc address and load library. SSL download. Makes an SSL connection to this machine, downloads the file into memory. The Fakeload engine I talked about previously, and our first PE payload, written in C. Benefits. This concept permits an attacker to execute a remote application using the existing virtual address space and process of his target. Every privilege and resource within that target application will become available to him. And if system access, he can write his payload assuming a system, with no initializations, anything else. For our example, we're going to use the Rio payload, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But Rio doesn't need to initialize certain things normally would to get privileges. Impersonation schemes, root to self kind of schemes. It's there, it's got everything it needs. Since we didn't open a file on disk, create a process, create a thread, detecting this is extremely difficult. Prevent these kind of attacks, the best solution is normalization. We've learned over the last 20 years, over and over again, if an attacker gets local access to your machine, he can execute instructions. There's no way to stop him. He'll figure out a way. It'll take time, he'll do it. Virus writers have been doing this at AV for the last 20 years, over and over and over again. Once they're there, once they're executing instructions, it's only time. Man, we may see some of it, but the more secure the system, the more quietly they keep their secrets.
Have any major viruses or worms been assembled by publicly available engines, or are they everyone actually still virus but can't know?
Yeah, most of them. I'll go off in a section on kind of a forensic thing. You can almost tell who wrote a payload or what country the payload came from by how it's constructed. Certain countries use certain schemes. They more usually do it by hand. The first rev they'll write in a compiler. Like I always showed you, I have the assembly in Visual C using inline. I'll write it kind of like that, using you have a naked declaration to take out the prelude and prologue, various other declarations in Visual C to make it more suitable for writing. Sometimes people will use NASM too, of course. 132 is assembler. At the MASM, Microsoft's. But yeah, they usually write it in C and then begin converting it over. Because writing it all in assembly is a very tedious process, especially when this thing gets big. You can tell if the payload is written in C by how it's constructed. You'll see a lack of mops, filler. Code Red, you saw there's a series where they just placed mops and knocked out things because they don't want to have to reconstruct jumps, reconstruct offsets. It's a very tedious process. Once they just take a function out, they have to reconstruct everything. You see those knobs? You can pretty much tell it was written in assembler. When it's really clean and there's no knobs, no nothing else, and sometimes you'll see preludes or prologues left in there. Or things from like a check ESP, it's a function in a debug mode, Visual C, to check make sure the stacks value hasn't been corrupted. You'll see these kind of signatures. You know it's written in C using a compiler. Various countries use certain schemes. The Chinese have a tendency of pushing strings in the stack. Only a few Americans do this. We Americans usually create data sections, or tables. RV engine design. Europe, New Zealand, the Chinese and Japanese, they usually use a kind of a mid-delta export loader scheme. What they have, say you have kernel 32 here, 778. Another version may be at 779. That's illogical, but say it is. You have that delta in the middle, where kernel 32 will be on both versions. So they pick a point in the middle, and they scan back to the base. That's how they get the base. But using that it's kind of a pathology to it. It's kind of interesting. You wonder why virus writers claim they wrote these new worms. These guys know exactly who wrote it by their styles. Whoever wrote Code Red, this person knew who it was without him having to say anything, because of his style, because of certain ways he optimizes. If you look at payloads, you see some people use certain registers. They have a tendency, for whatever reason. Maybe they always use EAX and EBX. Maybe they don't utilize added chip features. They don't use exception handlers. Payload forensics. It's one of the projects we're working on at EI now, is developing a forensic lab. So when we have a new worm that comes out, we can take it in. We use a scheme of call tracing, a kind of guard page scheme, so we can dump out a report immediately. Take it out, dump out a report, all the functions that were called, the behavior of the worm, so we get that to the public as fast as possible. And also kind of a forensic angle. I mean, I'm not law enforcement, obviously, and I never want to be a part of that. That's way too much hassle for me right now. But it's interesting, nevertheless, to begin developing these technologies. So there's nothing there. These things are launched, and no one knows who did it, who wrote it. There's no clue. This worm will cost, Code Red cost $2 billion in damage. We have no clue. What keeps one of these countries that we're currently in bad terms with? There's nothing there. It's morality. That's all that's stopping these people now. That was my rant. Rio. Rio is it's a nickname, it's kind of a fighter pilot term. And it's the radar intercept officer. This is the guy in the back of the jet that pretty much handles controls, weapon systems, kind of the aim for the pilot. We named the payload Rio because it kind of piggybacks on Fakeload when it goes in and begins monitoring local network traffic, same as a Rio would do. Rio initializes the active interface, and using a simple signature scheme, looks for data on the local network segment. Once it sees that, it captures the entire stream, and then passes it to the attacker. It's kind of a micro sniffer in a sense, using raw sockets. It's approximately 300 bytes. Compiled in Visual C, of course, it's around 30 kilobytes. Well, there's another reason for that too, which we'll talk about in a sec. Our demonstration. Now I'll go over this one more time. What I'm going to do is I have my machine here. This is a Win2K no service pack 0 we'll call it. I'm going to make an SSL connection to this machine. Exploited the dot printer hole. Because of the SSL connection, IDS will have a hard time seeing this. Once Fakeload is initialized inside the address space of IIS, it will connect out through another SSL connection back to this machine. So this is taken over, connects back to here. Downloads a payload, our Rio payload, into memory in this process. And then, once it's initialized, Rio will activate the network and watch the segment, just my little crossover cable network here for the example. Watch the segment for anything that has the word R Hassell for communications. Email, chat, something else. It'll watch for that traffic and then capture it. Once it's captured it, it's going to fire off a packet using whatever covert scheme you want to choose back to the attacker. You could use email, SSL, anything else. I use UDP so everyone can see what's going on. My second SSL connection is in clear text, so I can kind of emphasize and point out various things we do. But realistically, 2 SSL connections, covert channel, maybe SSL, maybe use a NetBIOS scheme, label encoding, so it looks like normal traffic. Broadcast it, who knows, regardless. Let's do our demo. There we go. It's now inside the process, waiting for traffic. You can see the download here. It's hidden inside a GIF using a simple stego scheme. I put the payload in the back of the image using a simple permutation so it looks like part of the image. Downloads it across, takes it out of the image, executes it. This is the original exploit session, of course, SSL, as we talked about. Now, when I write my friend an email over there, well, if I can write an email, send it off. There we go. There's the email. It was fired back across the network to this machine. As you can see. Now let's go to some of the high points of what just happened. Just key points about the demonstration. Most, if not all, IDSs will be bypassed because of the uses of encryption. More reliably, you want to use your own custom encryption scheme, something that a system can be developed to see. Maybe your own custom RSA kind of scheme, PKI scheme. The majority of local security systems will also be bypassed because we don't use any hot point APIs, they call them, like a create process, something else. Something else is usually hooked by AV systems or local security systems. The target process will also continue to operate after the Fakeload. We're going to go and check out that image that we just downloaded. Hopefully I don't get sued for this. Okay. It's an old Betty page. The payload's actually hidden inside this image. We'll go and check that out real quick. Actually, I've taken it out already, but we'll go and look at it anyways. I just put a SIG EI in there. I just scanned forward for that. With image schemes, they're frame-based. You can place a payload after the last frame. When the image is read, there's a header it sees the size, it only reads that much, processes the image. You can append data. It's a very simple stego scheme, easy to detect. And there's our payload. Now, say someone sees this, and they go and they want to see what it does. I can't copy and paste. I'm going to go back to, on the desktop, I have that example. This is the payload. It runs normally. That's just, you're not going to see anything, of course, because it just sends a UDP packet back. Now, what if you want to reverse this? Maybe you guys are familiar with IDA. IDA is a disassembler tool for reverse engineering applications and understanding them. Most people use IDA to figure out what's going on in a worm. I actually TE-locked this payload. I modified a fake loader to handle packed encrypted binaries. It's a kind of a special version of TE-lock that I wrote. I'm using the existing TE-lock schemes, but adding a little bit stronger encryption and a little bit better compression. Actually, Derek Soder helped me with that. So we're going to go and check it out in IDA. That's what happens. You can't view it. Now, you may be able to configure IDA in a way to where you can see it. You read it as a raw file, and you force disassembly in certain sections. Let's see what happens when you put a debugger on it. I'll launch my payload again. There's my NTDLL ret. I go forward. Access violation. It's T-lock. F5 again. T-lock. That beep was the bugger being detected. You can't view the payload. It's still encoded, still encrypted. When a payload's locked like this, there's not much you can do to reverse it. If you know, it basically takes a software cracker. Someone that has those abilities, or used to be when he was younger. A lot of people in the security industry have that kind of background. For someone like that, they can usually get their TLOck fairly fast. But for a lot of us that don't have that background, this kind of thing's a pretty big pain in the ass. I spent numerous nights, small bugs in my payloads, having to go trying to figure out what happened, and digging through TLOck, and it's a nightmare. There's a reason a lot of people use it. One more thing, too, we'll go over. Take out the SSL so you can see the exploit. I should probably actually continue with the bugger, huh? Yeah, damn T-lock. Let's restart that. Okay. Buy some more RAM too. There's our payload inside content type. It's our ASCII payload. Due to the limitations I had in host of corrupting my stack frame, I put it in content type. I'll show why. This goes back to that scheme of payload placement. Where to place your payload to get around the restrictions. I read into NTDLL to a jump ESP with a host, the host or IS host buffer overflow inside the dot printer SAPI. The overflow's on the stack, stack-based overflow. So it'll corrupt the frame if I overwrite too much. I don't want to trigger a fault or kill the process in any way. So I put my code somewhere else. The ISAPI when data is passed an ISAPI filter to actual DLL, there's a structure that's passed in that contains various pointers, various information about that session. One of them is the content type. So I return back into my little host, kind of like seek, we call them. A little piece of code is to find your payload in the virtual address space. It jumps back to a previous part in the buffer, takes the pointer off the stack. This is our ISAPI structure. And then I add 60 to it because I know the offset of the content type down here. And I move the pointer into ECX. That's a good point, thank you. Seattle's killing me. But using an existing structure in the IS server, we can just navigate to our payload. Simple enough, using an existing portion of our protocol. As I would like to show you, but obviously I'm not paying very much attention, so. Okay. Let's go back to our demonstration. And in the future, new technologies that can be used in the future. Custom payload packers and encryptors. Right now you have tools like Untitled that'll greatly aid in reversing that payload. Untitled will work on my version. It'll take it and reverse it back to its original state, so you can reverse it. But if people start writing more custom packers and encryptors, you won't have a way to take that shell off, that pseudo loader. You have to go through it by hand. Passive payload injection. It can modify Rio to where Rio doesn't look for our Hassell, it looks for EI 2003 : command. And then once it sees after the colon, it takes the payload off the stream and then executes it. So the only way you'll see that payload is if you're monitoring all network traffic, which we don't have drivers that big. Task-based payloads, tiering. Using multiple payloads to accomplish a job. Maybe you have a payload that you inject that'll scan a network for security holes and communicate with another payload. They'll actually exploit these. They'll communicate with another payload that'll go out and seek the piece of information you want, automating an entire attack. They would normally take a team of 5 or 10 hackers to penetrate a corporate network. Now it's one payload, or a series of payloads. Tiering. Automated privilege escalation engines. I'm kind of working on a project called This More. It's a Unix payload that looks at entry points, tries to find like the entry point or uses of get up long, your command line operation functions. Once it's find that, I take the address from the data section, take the command flags, go to a very simple kind of a permutation fuzzing, looking for a buffer overflow. I can catch a fault. When I catch a fault, depending on the OS, like Solaris 7 was my example, dumps a core file. Take the core file, you can parse it, automate escalating root privileges. Only way to stop this kind of attack is to study the algorithm and replicate it and find every security hole that it found. On older systems, it'll carve through any old Unix system. The newer one's a little bit more secure, but if you automate one of those attacks in Solaris 7, and there's hundreds of buffer overflows in local binaries still, especially if you're using an Intel version. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. There's a lot of patch issues with Intel versions. The Sparks are a lot more maintained, as much as Sun maintains them, but they're a lot more maintained. Multiple architecture engines. I talked about the pseudo assembly before. Writing payloads that will work on all architectures. Maybe like a Java payload, for example. It'll work on anything. Where that infection vector becomes a lot bigger, a lot much more of a risk. Anti-forensic engines. I talked about forensics earlier, identifying who wrote a payload. You can write an engine like a metamorphic engine to modify your mannerisms and remove them from the payload, kind of virginize it to a typical state. And there's no longer any forensics, any way to figure out what's going on. And then embedded payloads. Like FX is working on a lot of embedded projects. We'll probably see some, as we've seen already, some pretty scary embedded payloads coming to Black Hat, going from cell phones to network devices to accomplish various jobs. Maybe you make a payload to tap a telephone conversation. Who knows? Any questions? 0?
You said mostly example by IBM
I firmly believe if an attacker gets local execution, that's it. I mean, I don't think, I think a local security system, I think it intercepts a great product. I think it's an added layer. You have to have normalization, something else that will stop that. As far as detecting it, very different payload. Don't use a public one. Signature matching systems, behavior analysis systems, only watch for what they know is bad. It's like firewall designs you guys are familiar with. You don't take out the bad stuff, only allow the good. Same kind of scheme. If you don't know about it, it'll snake through. It just takes writing payloads using uncommon APIs. Most local security systems will hook a series of NT APIs. You find the ones that doesn't hook, use those. Or you find a flaw in one of those APIs. Or use a direct gate. Most local security systems will hook user LAN or kernel and GDT, hook these entry points. Use raw interrupts that aren't there. The GDI calls, exploit one of those to get your code in. Various other schemes. I think that the true solution is strong normalization, number one. Some product. You pick your own. I'm not going to do a sales pitch up here. But normalization is something that normalizes the traffic as strong as it can to verify the right data is in the right place. There's no reason why there's a 2,000 byte random ASCII header and content type. It should be is lower, is upper, slash, is lower, is upper, termination. That's it. Nothing else. If you totally normalize traffic, it becomes extremely difficult to write payloads that will work, even given the size of, like, our ASCII encoder is huge. If that was limited to 128 bytes, that wouldn't have worked. Normalization. This becomes a lot more complicated, we've noticed, multilingual systems, where they have various multilingual schemes. So their range of values goes out and exceeds the normal range. But for English systems, you can filter and control all traffic coming in. The only way to get into one of those DLLs, or to exploit successfully, is to have an address that's in the ASCII range. We talked about rebasing. Rebase everything outside that range. What do you have left? There's not much. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's layering. It's sort of normalization. Intercept maybe next. Maybe then antivirus. Update your fixes. Combination of schemes. Make it so complicated and so undetectable that his payload won't work. One scheme will not, a firewall and IDS will not stop them. It's layering schemes. Have a series of layers. Any other questions? What was that? Yeah. Let's see, let's take an existing program. T-lock, just talk about it. You have, in the software protection industry, you have packers and cryptors, where they take a file on disk and they compress all the sections, removing unnecessary sections, unnecessary data, compress it, and then inside the code they put like a little decompression routine, which will decompress it. On top of that, they add encryption. They encrypt the sections, change the names. IDA, as most reverse engineering tools look at, they expect images to be fairly normal. IDA does have a lot of power where you can go into a raw mode where you disassemble at raw points, but most of your data is encrypted. So you're going to run around all day trying to find the entry point and try to unassemble there. It's more or less just by creating a corrupted P, more or less. That's like you corrupt an image. Feed it to an image program, it might crash. Same thing. They read off specs. But I will say that IDA can be used to disassemble these things. It's not end all. You just don't load it as a P. For example, if I want to look at that payload again, I can go into raw mode. A binary file. Then it won't parse it as a P. Oops. And we just find the code in there. The entry point's, I think, 1,000. Somewhere in here. Anyways, you find the code, you type C to convert to code, and you view it there, and you just kind of walk around, try to find it. Now, I recommend using like an unlock tool. Check those tools first. Any other questions? Yeah, can you say that again?
Like taking use of your environment and
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's tools called yes, actually a very valid point. There's a tool called ice dump. It's for soft ice. There's also frog ice, various other tools you can use to where maybe you insert a series of bytes somewhere to trigger a fault. Just detect that in soft ice and then dump it. But well, let's go back to our example. Then again, start soft ice. Is it loading? No, T-lock detects soft ice. If it's there, it'll exit out. But ultimately what you would do when reversing a packed or encrypted binary, you put a break on the entry point. Whether it's a memory break, some other break in soft ice, then once you're there, you try and walk through the decoding of the image. If it detects soft ice, you're going to run into problems. So maybe it's better to get after the decoding. Put a point there. Maybe take some of the sections and corrupt them so a false generated. Like you may not need a resource section. So you can just corrupt the resource section. Then you can see the actual code when a false generated. But yeah, use ice dump. Actually, you can play MP3s too in soft ice. If a lot of you guys are soft ice users, you've always wanted to be able to play music while you're working around your debugger. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, let's see. Going back to normalization. We emphasized on stopping various attacks. Now, it is possible to bypass some normalization schemes just by mimicking your data using decoders. But that is a total solution. I mean, I wish I could recommend a product to you guys, but there's not one that's that powerful yet. It takes a lot of time to go through the protocol and put these restrictions on. It's a lot of work. And you also run into the problem, what about features you miss? What if there's an added feature like an IIS to SAPI that has its own custom scheme, like front page uses Vermeer encoding? We have to incorporate that. Let's see. What else can I show you guys? I can kind of race through here. No, that's more or less it. Let me show you our lab. This is our payload creation lab. This is where we build our payloads. This is Ryan's initial creation. We have our loaders, RVA loaders. We have our payloads. We have our decoders. And we link them together. It's kind of like an exploit building toolkit. So if I want to make a new decoder, new decryption routine, incorporate in there, I build it in, and then I link them up. Decoder first, text, data, like around kind of like our exploit file format. Allows us to quickly build payloads, configure them, change them, set them off. Okay, that's pretty much it. Thank you. Any more questions at all before I'm done? Go get some sleep. Yeah, actually a lot of great information. Go to, it's 29a.box.sk. Just search for 29a, it's hex for 666. It's a virus writing group. All of their documents, great documents, a lot of information there on metamorphic engines, polymorphic engines, EPO, most of the techniques you see in the security industry of RVA, loaders. It all came from these guys.
What was the URL again?
The URL, that was, it's 29a.box.sk. A lot of great information there. You know, I'd like to say that I invented a lot of these techniques, but there's no way. These guys have done it before. All the RVA techniques I've shown, we may have created them in our lab, but these guys have done it before, probably 10 years ago. Every time I think I find a new engineer create one, I go back and some guy, Zombie or Metal Driller, will show me that he wrote it back in the early 90s. All the schemes there have been around. We're not reinventing anything here. They're there. They've been there for 10 years. We're just not paying attention and going in researching viruses. There's been a big gap between software crackers and virus writers. We always assume, okay, what they're doing is bad. Let's not research what they're doing. Well, it's the opposite. We need to know how these things work. When these schemes are combined in this blended threat kind of scheme, then it becomes more dangerous. We need to understand them. So I mean, I don't be fearful of going and reading about virus information. Learn about them. These techniques will be used in payloads. As we're seeing, there's a slow growth in the next 10 years. In the last 5, these technologies are slowly migrating over to payloads. Yeah, that's probably the best thing out there. I can't really think of any other ones offhand I'd recommend. There's also a PHG as a group. I forget the acronym. You can search for it, and an opcode. They have a great, a whole series of documents in NT, undocumented, going into APIs, disassemblies, all sorts of information. The entire opcode list for the Intel chip, all the features, cycles, low-level guides to WinSock, device driver programming, a lot of great stuff. Also, PHG, yeah. PHG. If you guys have any questions about anything during my presentation, let me put my contact information up there.
Quick question. You mentioned earlier you were talking about profiling, where code originated based on style, things like that.
Yeah.
Take on slam, where did that come from?
I'm not going to point fingers. I'm not a politician, I'm a researcher. Somebody else's business. Any other questions? I could have a logical guess, but yeah. Maybe if you buy me a couple of drinks later at the bar, I'll talk a little bit. There we go. Here's my contact information. Let's get that up on the screen. You guys have any questions at all about anything in this presentation? Or there's a worm that comes out, something else? Go ahead. Well, this is going great. Hassell, RHASSELL @EUIE.com. Yeah, any questions at all about anything in this presentation, go ahead, fire them off. I have a lot of spare time. I'm finally going to get some sleep now. Thank you.